The Russian foreign policy is based on two key aims: to advance and reinforce a communist revolution and to protect the nation from the approaching Second World War. Between 1928 and 1941, Soviet foreign policy evolved significantly in response to the changing international landscape. However, while the USSR achieved some success in pursuing its foreign policy aims, many of its efforts were undermined by internal contradictions and reactive decision-making. Its success in achieving these aims was mixed. Some goals met through strategic alliances and pragmatic diplomacy, while others were subverted by mistrust, shifting priorities, and the broader geopolitical context. As historical author Geoffrey Hoskins states in his publication, Soviet foreign policies of the 1930s were deeply reactive. This proves Soviet foreign policy was driven by short-term survival, opportunism, and paranoia rather than a long-term vision. By the late 1920s, the Soviet Union remained relatively isolated internationally. Stalin prioritized internal consolidation through collectivization and industrialization, while foreign policy at this stage continued to serve as a means of advancing the broader communist agenda and ideology, primarily remaining a central objective. The Comintern facilitated this objective by promoting the Soviet Union's vision to a worldwide revolution. Through Comintern, Russia supported communist parties across Europe and beyond, providing training, funding, and ideological direction. Leaders such as Georgy Dmitriev, who became the head of the Comintern in 1935, played a crucial role in coordinating this international communist effort and facilitating the current foreign policies. However, the foreign policy to spark a worldwide communist revolution was a failure, as Western governments remained distrustful to the Soviet Union and foreign communist parties lacking the size and cohesion for influence. According to historian Jason Dorsey, in the 1935 French elections, the French Communist Party only held around 10% of the seats in the National Assembly. Due to this, communist parties in countries such as Germany, France, and Britain remained on the fringes of politics. The rise of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's consolidation of fascist power in Italy further posed a major threat, not only to communist ideology, but now to its national security, consequently shifting the Soviet Union's foreign policy to improve its chances of success. Stalin increasingly prioritized a second aim: protecting the Soviet Union from external threats, much over the original ideological goal of exporting revolution. This pragmatic shift was evident in the Soviet Union's effort to build alliances in the 1930s, notably its support of the Popular Front strategy, which encouraged cooperation between communist and non-communist leftist groups in Europe, the goal being to unite against the common threat of fascism. Seen in the Spanish Civil War, where the Soviet Union supported the Republican side against Franco's fascist forces. As described by I. Zemskov in his publication, The Soviet Foreign Policy 1917 to 1980, under the coordination of Soviet diplomat Marcel Rosenberg and the NKVD agents such as Alexander Orlov, the USSR sent over 1,000 military advisors, around 1,000 aircraft, and supplied $81 million worth of aid to Spanish Republicans. While the intervention showed the USSR actively opposing fascism and spread its foreign influence, its failure highlighted the limitations of its foreign policy, contributing to its inability to prevent World War II. Hoskins states in his book that the Civil War was both a genuine attempt to oppose fascism and a cynical effort to dominate the leftist movement abroad. The Soviet Union's inconsistent support was a defining issue, also prioritizing gaining power and controlling the direction of the leftist movement over genuine foreign unity, to which they claimed. Ultimately, Franco's victory was a blow to both the ideological and strategic goals of the Soviet foreign policy. The Spanish Civil War both influenced and foreshadowed the USSR's limited success in securing national security. The drain of resources led to less preparation to effectively defend against Germany's eventual invasion. Simultaneously, Stalin pursued Western recognition and security to bolster the Soviet Union's foreign policy security, joining the League of Nations in 1934 with advocacy of Foreign Commissar Maxim Litvinov, and signing mutual assistance pacts with France and Czechoslovakia in 1935. These actions aimed to contain German aggression and secure Soviet borders. However, the alliances lacked military coordination, and the West remained hesitant to embrace the USSR. The Munich Agreement in 1938, where Britain and France appeased Hitler by allowing him to annex parts of Czechoslovakia without consulting the USSR, was a turning point. This event deeply undermined Litvinov's diplomatic efforts, eventually leading to his replacement by Vyacheslav Molotov in 1939. Stalin recognized the unreliability of the West and concluded the Soviet Union needed to secure its own future. Yet replacing Litvinov with Molotov shifted Soviet policy towards short-term pragmatism. This isolated the USSR, weakened alliances, and ultimately failed to prevent war with Germany, which came from one of the most controversial moments in the Soviet foreign policy, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was a strategic move to prioritize protecting the Soviet Union from immediate war. By signing a non-aggression treaty with Hitler, the USSR had temporary success in its foreign policy, as it both prevented war for a short period of time and brought itself valuable time to build up its defensive military and industrial strength, avoiding a two-front conflict. The secret protocols of the pact also allowed the Soviet Union to expand its territory by dividing Eastern Europe with Germany, annexing parts of Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. This moment exemplifies the opportunistic and contradictory nature of the Soviet diplomacy. Historian Patrick Kondrin supports this perspective that the Soviet Union was indeed opportunistic and contradictory in his perspective. The Soviet government was utterly unscrupulous in its conduct of foreign affairs. In aligning with a fascist regime it had previously denounced, the USSR compromised its ideological stance for strategic advantage. Following this pact, the USSR invaded eastern Poland on the 17th of September 1939. By June 1940, had annexed Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Bessarabia. As spoken by Dr. Alistair Kocher-Williams, approximately 23 million people were absorbed into the USSR as a result of these territorial gains. This was a temporary success in spreading Soviet influence, but it ultimately failed with the future loss of these territories. The territorial gains served as both a strategic effort to extend communist influence and a defensive military purpose to expand a strategic buffer zone to protect itself from any future invasions, aligning itself temporarily with two of its primary foreign policies. In the short term, the pact effectively kept the Soviet Union out of the broader war as Germany focused on the Western Front. The pact itself was a diplomatic gamble involving significant risks, in itself being a contradiction of core communist ideology. The alliance with a fascist regime undermined the credibility of the Comintern and provoked widespread disillusionment among communist supporters globally, ending any chance of communist revolutions. Moreover, while it may have delayed war for Russia, it did not prevent it. Operation Barbarossa, launched by Germany in June 1941, marked a major escalation in the war and revealed the inadequacy of Soviet preparations, despite the non-aggression pact. The German invasion involved over 3 million troops, making it the largest military operation in history at the time. While the pact achieved short-term strategic gains, its long-term consequences proved disastrous, undermining the effectiveness of Soviet foreign policy. Operation Barbarossa exposed the ineffectiveness of Soviet foreign policy as the Nazi-Soviet pact isolated the USSR, held full security, and let Germany expand unchecked, leaving the Soviet Union vulnerable for inevitable invasion and war. So that leaves the question, just how successful was the Soviet foreign policy overall between 1928 and 1941? On one hand, the USSR did make gains in securing its borders, delaying direct conflict with Germany, and expanding its territory and influence. The shift from ideological purity to pragmatic diplomacy allowed the Soviet Union to navigate a dangerous international environment and, for a time, avoid being dragged into another large-scale war it couldn't afford. Stalin's foreign policy also helped give the Soviet Union time to complete some of its industrialization efforts, which would later prove vital in its resistance against the Nazi invasion. As seen on the official Harvard website from historian Mark Kramer, by 1940, Soviet industrial output had increased by 400% compared to 1928, largely due to the 5-year plans initiated under Stalin. The 5-year plan strengthened the Soviet economy and military, enabling temporary foreign policy success by expanding Soviet influence before wartime losses. This demonstrates the direct link between internal economic policy and the foreign policy success. Industrial capacity was also critical to military preparedness and thus to national security. On the other hand, the ideological aim of spreading communism was largely sidelined or outright unsuccessful. While the Comintern remained active, it had little real impact on the global balance of power. The USSR's credibility as a revolutionary power weakened due to compromises with non-communist and fascist regimes. Furthermore, Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, including the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact deals, alienated allies, minimized trust, and isolated the USSR, weakening military support and ultimately failing to secure lasting diplomatic or military stability, limiting military support and weakening the effectiveness of foreign policy to avoid war. Another factor being the international contradiction in Stalin's approach. The purges of the Red Army leadership during the late 1930s severely weakened Soviet military preparedness, which undermined the very goal of national security. As seen on Dr. Alistair Kocher-Williams' video report, between 1937 and 1939, over 35,000 officers were purged, including 3 out of 5 marshals, 13 out of 50 army commanders, and 50% of all officers. The Great Purge, while aimed at consolidating internal control, had direct influence on proving the foreign policy a failure, weakening leadership and leaving the Soviet Union's military vulnerable just as war became inevitable. The intelligence failures and military chaos in the early stages of the German invasion showed that, despite efforts to build diplomatic buffers, the USSR was still vulnerable. In summary, the Soviet foreign policy between 1928 and 1941 was affected by a shift from revolutionary idealism and pragmatic survivalism. While it achieved some short-term strategic goals, especially in delaying war and expanding Soviet influence, it failed to secure lasting alliances or significantly spread communism abroad. Its achievements were undermined by the internal contradictions of Stalin's leadership, such as the Great Purge and industrialization policies, which, while aimed at strengthening the state, often weakened its international standing or exposed its strategic weaknesses, debilitating military leadership and straining resources, leaving the USSR vulnerable and diplomatically isolated. The success of Soviet diplomacy was ultimately undercut by the invasion and war in 1941. Despite some tactical victories, communism's lack of influence in other nations failed to spark a revolution, and inconsistency in military tactics leading to a consequential alliance with Nazi Germany led to the Soviet Union failing to avoid the war. At most, the broader aims of the Soviet foreign policy remained only partially fulfilled